Hey class, today we're going to talk about the U.S. Constitution as a document of compromises. Now, you've been reading about the Constitution in your textbook for the past couple days. I thought this might be a nice break and kind of drive home a couple of the points made in the book about the compromises necessary to create the Constitution. You're aware that from U.S. history class that the Constitution was formulated over several months in 1787 in Philadelphia. And really, when it comes right down to it, the 12 colonies that were there putting together this document of compromises, of course, Rhode Island didn't make the trip, represented a broad swath of the colonial magnates, the richest and most educated people. But they had a lot of differences, a lot of sectarian differences. Southerners, Northerners, planters, farmers, lawyers, business people, all these different interests, and yet they had to come together and form a document that they could all agree to live with. So what are some of these compromises that they struck? Well, of course, you know about the big ones. The legislative compromise creating a bicameral legislature, the direct or indirect election of the President of the United States. Again, coming out of the Articles of Confederation, you already know that none of the founders were keen on creating a strong executive or at the risk of creating a new king. So they had to come up with a way to select that president democratically and yet protect interests that we'll talk about here in a second. What to do with the judiciary. They didn't have a national judiciary under the Articles of Confederation at all. And finally, the 64,000-pound elephant in the corner, the issue of slavery. How to compromise on this issue that many Northerners opposed, and for the Southerners, it was a deal breaker. First, the legislature. You're all familiar with the Connecticut Compromise, which basically was the result of two competing plans. The Virginia plan, which based representation on population. The more people that lived in your state, the more representatives you would have in the legislature. And that was favored by large states. Now, by the way, there's more to the Virginia plan than just that. Okay? I'm glossing over the details. Okay? For our purposes, I want you to focus in on this idea that the Virginia plan basically based representation on population. Likewise, the New Jersey plan had other parts to it. I want you to consider, though, that their real big focus was on equal representation by state. Okay? The Connecticut Compromise took those two ideas, put them together, and created a bicameral legislature, a two-chamber legislature, a House of Representatives that would be based on population, based representation on population, and then a smaller Senate, which would be based on equal representation for each state, 2 senators from each state. Okay, this was a big sticking point between the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and this Connecticut Compromise resolved it. Second compromise was how to select a president. Do you want direct election of the president, or would there be some form of indirect selection of the president? Now, why didn't the founders want direct election of the president? Well, okay, I've heard that some people say, oh, they were afraid of the people that lived in the country, and that's a very kind of revisionist history view. Look, it comes down to simple logistics, okay? The United States at the time, or this nascent country that was trying to become the United States, stretched from Maine in the north. And by the way, at this point, Maine was part of Massachusetts. It hadn't been separated as its own state yet, or its own colony. But from Maine to basically the northern border of Florida along the coast of the eastern seaboard and stretched inland to the Appalachian Mountains. It's a massive area. And what was the quickest form of transportation over land? Horse. Okay? There were no roads to speak of. The only roads there were in towns, and otherwise you had dirt tracks between cities. It would take months to travel during bad weather, weeks to travel in the best of weather. Okay, so how are you going to hold a nationwide election under those circumstances and guarantee that it wouldn't be a corrupt process? Exactly. There is no way to do it. Okay, so I want you to consider that as one of the big parts of why we have a indirect selection of the president. Okay, each state votes on its own. The logistical problem is solved much easier, and I'll go into that here in a second. The favorite son concern, having a regional candidate who might attract a lot of attention and a lot of support from a couple of the larger states, let's say, maybe a New England candidate from the north or a southern candidate in the south. There was a lot of concern that a person might get elected based on just regional support, and the founders were concerned about that. They wanted somebody who would appeal across the entire country, not just regionally. That favorite son concern was real. Now, there's also a fear of direct democracy, but the fear of direct democracy was founded less on not trusting the public, because keep in mind, at this time in 1787, the voting population was restricted to landowning white males. Okay, so we're talking about a group of people that were the same class, social class, as the founders themselves. Okay, the fear of direct democracy really has its roots in the classical education of the founders themselves. Keep in mind that most of the founders were educated based on the Greek, studying Greek classics, studying Greek government, the Roman traditions, the Roman, reading in Latin, Horace and Seneca, and all of these greats from back in the day, from the Roman Empire and also from the Greek times, including about the Athenian democracy. Look, the Athenian democracy only lasted about 110, 120 years. Why? Because demagogues, charismatic dictators, essentially, co-opted the system. They took it over. They got themselves elected and then essentially set themselves up as tyrants within the system. Okay, so they knew that. They'd studied it when they were in school, and they knew that direct democracy carried risks. Okay, the risks of a demagogue taking over the system. They didn't want that risk. Okay, which I'm sure you can understand. So what are some benefits of having an indirect electoral college system? Well, look, it requires the president to have support across the country, not just in one region, for reasons that we'll talk about when we get to the electoral college in a couple months. It contributes to political stability because it favors a two-party system. Although the Constitution, one of the big failings in my mind of the Constitution is that it didn't anticipate factionalism. It didn't anticipate the rise of political parties and didn't account for them. I think that's one of the big failures of the founders. They didn't recognize human nature in that regard, in that one piece. But with that said, it ultimately contributes to political stability because it encouraged the formation of two political parties rather than a multitude like in a parliamentary system, which may be more democratic, small d democratic, but less stable. And keep in mind, it also supported the idea of federalism. Okay, we are a federal system. We have states today, we have 50 states, each that holds its own election. Okay, so just as the federal principle holds that the states have certain things they do at the state level, and then the national government has certain things it does at the national level. We have 50 state elections plus one nationwide election, and that being in the electoral college to elect a president. So you have a mix of the direct election, in our modern case, 50 of them at the state level, to select the delegates to an electoral college, which then holds a national election. It's actually a pretty elegant system. More about that in future weeks and months. There's another compromise that not a lot of people talk about, but it involves the judiciary. Again, there was no national judiciary in the Articles of Confederation, and this was a new idea that they were coming up with. So the United States Supreme Court was going to be the Supreme Court in the country, the supreme law arbiter of federal decisions. But how do you rein something in like that? The founders knew that could be a really powerful thing. So Congress reserved to itself the power to create all the other courts below the Supreme Court. The U.S. Constitution only allows for the creation of one court, the U.S. Supreme Court. And it gives to Congress the power to determine how many members were going to serve on that court. The U.S. Supreme Court currently has 9 members, but you'll remember the court packing scheme of FDR, where he wanted to add a whole mess of members onto the Supreme Court. That was perfectly constitutional. Not how he went about, pushing that plan might have been a little aggressive, but it was constitutional. Why? Because Congress creates all the courts and establishes who serves on what courts, their jurisdiction, meaning what kind of cases they can hear, that kind of thing. And the executive gets to appoint all the justices and judges. So the courts may be an ultimate arbiter, but they couldn't create additional courts and they couldn't pick their own members. Okay, this is an example of checks and balances that's kind of cooked into the Constitution. We'll talk more about that when we get to the principles of the Constitution next week. But this is a great example of checks and balances. Now, the big issue was slavery. New England states wanted to outlaw slavery completely. Okay, it offended their religious sensibilities, it offended their moral sensibilities. Southern states wanted to count every slave as a person for representation in the national legislature. So you have two positions with a gulf between them. Okay, how do you bridge this issue? One side believes in the ownership of slaves and the other doesn't. How do you bridge this gap? Well, here are the 3 compromises incorporated into the Constitution. First, you guys are familiar with the 3/5 compromise. Each slave would count as 3/5 a person for purposes of determining population in the House of Representatives. Okay, now who benefited from that? Which side? Write about that answer that in the question that's in the Google Doc for you. Who benefited from that? Okay. Secondly, Congress could not pass a law outlawing slavery until after 1808. The importation of slaves, I should say, excuse me. Congress could not pass a law banning the importation of new slaves until 1808. That was about a generation, about 20 years after the Constitution would be ratified, 1787 to 1808. Why? Well, candidly, Southerners wanted to make sure they had enough time to import additional slaves, female slaves if they needed them, to make sure they could create a self-sustaining population of slaves. Who benefited from that? Finally, the fugitive slave laws. Fugitive slaves escaping to a non-slave state had to be returned to their home state if captured. Now, these 3 compromises are in the Constitution. The word slave doesn't exist in the Constitution. Okay, it's a really interesting example of verbal gymnastics to avoid using the word slave. Who benefited from the fugitive slave laws? Okay, and that'll go a long way to telling you how the compromise worked out, in whose favor. Okay, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Or excuse me, on Tuesday.